As the final bell of the school year echoed through the empty halls, students eagerly rushed out, ready to leave behind months of exams and assignments. But for some, the last day of school was anything but a cause for celebration. Beneath the excitement of summer break, something far more sinister was lurking, something that would change their lives forever. These are true, disturbing horror stories from the last day of school, accounts of eerie encounters, inexplicable events, and dark secrets that turned what should have been a day of freedom into a nightmare. Get ready to hear the chilling tales that will make you question everything about your own school days. Story 1: A Fourth Grade Nightmare. The man's hand was cold. I had no idea what part of him it was, whether it was the fingers, the palm, or something more grotesque that passed for a hand. The chill of it seemed to pierce through me, to reach deep into my bones. It didn't feel like the touch of a person, but of something that had long since ceased to be human. I froze under his grip, the cold spreading through my body like ice running through my veins, and for a fleeting second, I wondered if I would ever be able to escape him. His voice, soft and insistent, continued to echo through the basement. It wasn't a sound I could trust. Nothing in this house could be trusted. Not his words, not his promises. And yet I found myself moving again, one step in front of the other, feeling the weight of every inch of space between myself and the door that now felt miles away. The basement was vast, far too large for a space that was supposed to sit beneath a modest house. It was as though it was not simply a room beneath a home, but a place that extended outward in every direction, a void that swallowed all sound, all light. It seemed to stretch on forever, its oppressive blackness growing more suffocating with each moment. It was as though I were standing in the belly of some great creature, the earth itself closing in on me, trying to swallow me whole. The man had stopped speaking, and I could hear nothing now but the echo of my own breathing, shallow and quick, each inhale feeling more labored than the last. I could feel the darkness pressing in, the claustrophobia rising in my chest, choking out every thought but one: get out. I needed to leave, but there was no way out. The door had closed behind me with an ominous finality, and the basement felt like a tomb now, not a room in a house. I wanted to scream, but the silence was too thick, too heavy. Any sound I made would be swallowed by it, lost forever in the darkness that loomed around me. I could hear the man moving, but I no longer saw him. He had retreated somewhere in the shadows, and I couldn't even hear the sound of his steps. He was there, but it was as if he had dissolved into the air itself. The only sense I had of his presence now was his voice, still echoing faintly from some distant corner of the basement. It was a low murmur, a sound too indistinct to make out, but too unsettling to ignore. His voice had become a part of the house, woven into its very fabric, and with each passing second I felt the walls close in further, as if the house itself were breathing around me. I had stopped moving now, standing at the edge of the room, where the dim light from above barely reached. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and decay filled my nostrils. My heart raced in my chest, each beat louder than the last, each thump a reminder that I was still alive, still human, but only just. Everything in this basement seemed designed to make you feel anything but human. It was a place that belonged to something else, something ancient and unknowable. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to hold on to the shred of rationality that I still had left. I could hear the man's voice again, closer now. His words were clearer, but no less unnerving. They were almost comforting in a way. He spoke as though I were a child who needed reassurance, as though everything that was happening was perfectly normal. But nothing about this situation was normal. Nothing about it was real. I could feel the walls of the basement pressing in closer with each passing moment, the air growing heavier, suffocating me in its weight. My mind raced, searching for an escape, but it was as though the basement itself had become a labyrinth, each turn leading only deeper into its heart. There was no way out. I was trapped. And worse still, I felt as though I were being watched not just by the man, but by something else, something lurking in the shadows, something that had no name, no form. Something that had been here long before I arrived and would remain long after I was gone. The man's voice continued, almost hypnotic now, pulling me deeper into the web of his words. I could no longer make sense of what he was saying. His words had become a murmur, a chant, as if he were trying to lull me into some trance-like state. And I felt myself slipping, felt my will crumbling under the weight of his voice. He was getting inside my head, forcing me to believe that this was all some mistake, some misunderstanding, and that everything would be fine if I just did what he said. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't true. Nothing would be fine. This was at the moment everything changed. I turned, my body acting on its own accord, driven by an instinct that told me to run. But where would I go? The door was locked. The windows were sealed. There was no escape. The house itself had become a prison, its walls closing in tighter with each passing second. I moved toward the stairs, but the moment I turned my back on the darkness, I felt it shift. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then it became undeniable. The basement was no longer just a space, it had become a living thing, an entity that was aware of my every movement, of my every breath. The shadows stretched and twisted, reaching out toward me, as if they were trying to pull me back into their depths. I could hear the man's footsteps now, slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment, enjoying my terror. He was behind me, his presence so close that I could feel the chill radiating off him, as if he were some dark, cold thing that didn't belong in the world of the living. "Come back," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Dennis is waiting for you. He'll be so glad to see you." But I knew that wasn't true. Dennis wasn't waiting for me. Dennis wasn't even real. None of this was real. It was all a lie, a facade, a nightmare that I couldn't wake from. And then I heard the sound of the doorbell ringing, distant but unmistakable. The sound was like a crack of thunder, sharp and jarring in the oppressive silence of the house. It was followed by loud banging, the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on the front door. The police, I thought. They were here. Somehow they were here. The man froze, his face draining of color. The moment the first knock echoed through the house, I knew he was afraid. For the first time, I saw real fear, not the false mask of friendliness he had been wearing. His grip loosened on my wrist, and I seized the moment. I bolted, my feet pounding against the cold concrete as I raced toward the stairs. I could hear him behind me calling out, but his voice was fading. The sound of the doorbell was louder now, the banging growing more frantic, more desperate. I didn't dare look back. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't make it out. I had to keep moving, had to keep running. I reached the top of the stairs just as the door crashed open. Police officers flooded into the house, their shouts mingling with the man's frantic cries, but it was too late for him. The officers had found me and they were pulling me to safety. I didn't understand what was happening, but the relief was overwhelming. I was free. Outside, the daylight had returned, though it felt as though something had shifted in the world. The sun seemed colder, the air heavier, as though the normal world had been irrevocably altered. I could see my parents now, rushing toward me, my mother's face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She embraced me, her arms trembling around me, and I could feel her heart pounding in her chest. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, as though I were speaking from some other reality, the place where logic no longer applied. The officers were already speaking with Dennis's father, and the man who had taken me was being led away in handcuffs, his face contorted in anger and confusion. I learned later that the man was someone Dennis's father knew through work, a man who had been planning this for months. He had somehow found out about my playdate with Dennis, and had taken advantage of the situation to carry out his twisted plan. But the more I learned about him, the less I understood. It was as though the entire world had conspired to bring me to this moment to trap me in that basement. I still think about that day, even now, years later. I can still hear the sound of the doorbell ringing, the desperate pounding at the door, and I can still feel the man's hand on my shoulder, the coldness of it seeping into my very bones. He's still out there somewhere waiting. And though I've tried to push it from my mind, I wonder what if he's never truly gone. Story 2: The Reunion of Forgotten Souls. It begins, as these things so often do, with a letter. Not a message sent through the vast, formless ether of the internet. No, this was something far older, something that carried the weight of forgotten times. The envelope arrived one quiet morning, pale and yellowed with age, its corners bent and soft, as though it had traveled far longer than the brief span between sender and recipient. There was a kind of gravity to it, an air of the inevitable. I should have known better than to open it, but what else could I do? Curiosity is a compulsion, an itch in the mind that cannot be scratched away by reason or prudence. The handwriting was familiar, painfully so, though I hadn't seen it in years. Phoebe. I hadn't thought of her in. How long? A decade at least, perhaps longer. Time has a way of distorting memories, of twisting them into strange and unrecognizable shapes. But her name still stirred something deep inside me. A pang of nostalgia, yes, but something darker too. A gnawing unease that I couldn't quite place. Come the letter read, to see old faces and share memories of days long past. Such simple words, yet they carried with them the weight of forgotten things, things that I had tried, perhaps unsuccessfully, to leave behind. I should have thrown the letter away right then, let it disappear into the trash where so many other relics of my past had gone, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself holding on to it, reading it again and again, as though searching for some hidden meaning between the lines. There was something off about the letter, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The ink seemed to shift slightly under the dim light of my apartment, the letters almost vibrating on the page. And then there was the smell, the faint scent of mildew and decay that clung to the paper, as though it had been sitting in some dark, forgotten corner of the world for far too long. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Old paper often smells like that. The ink, too, it was probably just an illusion caused by the lighting, or perhaps my eyes playing tricks on me. I had been working long hours lately, staring at a computer screen for far too long, and I wasn't exactly getting younger. It was natural that my vision might blur or flicker, just as memories blur and flicker over time. Despite my better judgment, I responded. I wasn't sure why, perhaps out of a sense of obligation, or perhaps simply because I had nothing better to do. The days had been passing by in a kind of haze recently, one blending into the next with little to distinguish them. A reunion, however strange, was at least something to break the monotony. The day of the reunion arrived without fanfare, as such days often do. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray, the air thick with the promise of rain that never came. It felt as though the world were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, though I couldn't say what. I left my apartment in the late afternoon, following the directions Phoebe had provided in her letter. They led me to a part of town I hadn't visited in years, a place that seemed to exist on the fringes of my memory. The streets were eerily quiet, devoid of life, and the few buildings I passed seemed abandoned, their windows dark and empty. The house itself was not what I had expected. It stood at the end of a long, narrow street, half hidden behind a cluster of gnarled trees that seemed to twist unnaturally toward the sky. The mansion, for that's what it was, loomed before me, its once grand facade crumbling with age. The windows were shuttered, the curtains drawn tight, and the front door stood slightly ajar, as though it were waiting for me. There was something wrong about the house, though I couldn't quite say what. It felt alive in a way that buildings shouldn't. Not alive like a person or an animal, but alive in the way a storm or a disease is alive, something vast, indifferent and utterly beyond human comprehension. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the base of the stairs that led to the front door. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to walk away and never look back. But something else's strange pull, like the inexorable pull of gravity, drew me forward. I couldn't leave. Not yet, not until I had seen. What? I wasn't even sure. But there was something in that house that I needed to confront, something that had been waiting for me for far too long. I stepped inside. The air inside the house was thick and oppressive, a stale, musty smell that clung to everything. The hallway was dimly lit by a series of flickering lamps, their light casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing patches of dark, moldy wood beneath. Everything about the house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The kind of stillness that only exists in places long abandoned by the living. I could hear voices coming from deeper inside the house, low murmurs that seemed to blend together into a single, droning hum. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the narrow hallway. As I approached what appeared to be the main room, the voices grew louder, though I still couldn't make out any distinct words. It was as though the conversations were happening just beyond the reach of my understanding, slipping through my fingers every time I tried to grasp them. When I entered the room, I saw them, the other guests. At first glance, they seemed like people I should have known, faces that I should have recognized from my past. But as I looked closer, I realized that something was wrong. Their features were blurred, distorted in a way that made it impossible to focus on any one detail. It was as though they existed in some half-formed state, neither fully present nor fully absent. Their eyes, in particular, unsettled me, dark, hollow voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. For Phoebe was there, standing near the fireplace at the far end of the room. I recognized her, or at least I thought I did. Her face was familiar, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. She looked older, yes, but it wasn't just that. There was a coldness in her eyes, a kind of emptiness that hadn't been there before. When she saw me, she smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a hollow, mechanical thing, like the smile of a mannequin. "It's been a long time," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. There was no joy in her words, no warmth. It was as though she were going through the motions of a conversation she had rehearsed 1,000 times. I tried to engage her, to ask about the others, about the house, but her answers were vague, evasive. She seemed distracted, glancing around the room as though searching for something or someone. The other guests, meanwhile, continued their strange, murmured conversations, their words still slipping just out of reach. I felt a growing sense of unease, a crawling sensation at the back of my mind that told me something was very, very wrong. I wanted to leave. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of that house, to run as far and as fast as I could. But I couldn't. Something held me there, something far stronger than fear or reason. It was as though the house itself had wrapped its tendrils around me, rooting me to the spot. Then I saw him. The man stood at the far end of the room, half shrouded in shadow. His face was obscured, his features indistinct, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp. They bore into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, as though he could see right through me, into the darkest corners of my soul. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched me, his gaze unblinking and relentless. I turned to Phoebe, but she was gone. The guests, too, had disappeared, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room with the man who watched. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, a strangled whisper that barely escaped my lips. The man stepped forward, his movements unnaturally smooth, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "Leave," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "This isn't what it seems. None of this is real." Before I could respond, he vanished, swallowed by the shadows. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the harder I tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away, like a dream fading in the harsh light of day. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that house before it swallowed me whole. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The house seemed to twist and warp around me, the walls closing in, the doorways shifting. It was as though the house itself were alive, reshaping itself to keep me trapped inside. Finally, I reached the front door and burst out into the night. The air outside was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the house. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. But even now, as I stand here in the dark, I cannot shake the feeling that I haven't truly escaped. That the house, the shadows, and the man with the sharp eyes are still watching, waiting for the moment when I will return. Because deep down I know that I will. I know that the reunion isn't over. Not yet. Story 3: The Shadow in the Chemistry Lab. I have always wondered about the nature of presence, the quality that clings to a person, an object, a place, like a faint odor or the lingering sensation of something brushed against your skin that you cannot see. You know it's there, but the mind dismisses it, cataloging it as insignificant, until the day comes when you can no longer ignore it. I can tell you now, with a certainty that borders on obsession, that this is the nature of evil. It does not arrive with the bluster of grand entrances, nor with the sharp sting of sudden violence. It creeps in quietly, folding itself into your life like an old coat, fitting perfectly at first, until it weighs so heavily upon you that you can no longer move. It began in the most innocuous of settings, chemistry class, a place of molecular bonds, balancing equations, and predictable reactions. It was supposed to be a refuge from the chaotic unpredictability of human interaction, an arena of rules and logic, where everything could be made to fit into neat compartments. At least, that's how I saw it until Zach arrived. Zach was a name that meant nothing to me at first. I have never been one for the grand theater of first impressions, and in truth, he seemed rather unremarkable in every way. The only thing I remember clearly now, with a sense of creeping discomfort, was the way he existed. Zach wasn't there in the way other people were. He did not fill the space around him, rather, he seemed to absorb it, bending the space in subtle ways I would not understand until later. The kind of person who enters a room and, though his body is present, his soul seems to remain distant. His physicality was heavy, an unnatural presence that I couldn't quite place. His clothes hung loosely on him, ill-fitting, like he was lost in them, more an object of the world than a participant in it. Zach's face was the kind of forgettable that made it impossible to remember his features clearly unless forced. His beard, patchy and unkempt, was the most striking feature about him, and that alone was enough to fill his presence with a kind of awkward grotesquerie. He had the look of someone who existed solely on the edges of human interaction, someone who rarely ventured into the daylight of human connection, but instead lurked in the shadowed corners, constantly aware but never quite engaging. At first, our interaction was entirely academic, and even that seemed strained. He offered help. Unsolicited, of course, but it wasn't the kind of help that demanded gratitude. It was help given with a quiet air of expectation, as though it were the natural order of things for him to assist me. I would never have asked him for assistance, but there was something disarming about his offer. I was struggling in chemistry, and the help he provided was often the only lifeline I had in a sea of confusion. I accepted, reluctantly at first. He would explain things that, for whatever reason, seemed easier to understand through his explanations. The simplicity of his words, the clinical precision in his approach, offered some strange comfort. It was like he was holding a mirror up to my ignorance, showing me the patterns I could never quite see on my own. He would let me copy his work, take his answers during the labs, even during tests. And somehow, despite all this, I felt a creeping unease, as though the very act of accepting this help was entangling me in a way I couldn't explain. But I ignored it. For a time, I even welcomed the dependence. Zach wasn't the kind of person who would be seen as threatening, not in the usual sense. He did not leer, did not speak in a tone that suggested anything but an awkward, desperate desire to belong. There was a sickly sweetness to his words that, upon reflection, was the taste of manipulation veiled in kindness. His help was never truly selfless, there was always something more, some expectation beneath it. The help became a leash, something tethering me to him more tightly than I realized. And yet, it wasn't until the semester's end that I saw the true extent of his presence in my life. It was the last day of class, and I had hoped, with a bitter sort of finality, that it would be over, that this strange bond between us would dissolve into nothingness, that we would both simply disappear into the tapestry of college life, never to encounter one another again. But that was not to be. On the final day, when the exams had ended and the class was disbanding, Zach did something I hadn't anticipated. He asked me out. It was a clumsy request, one that carried the weight of his unspoken need, but it was a request nonetheless, and it left me speechless. I had never considered him that way, nor had I wanted to. His presence, which had once seemed like an inconvenience, now felt like something heavier, something more suffocating. His words hung in the air between us, like the aftermath of a failed experiment in error that could not be undone. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" he had asked, his voice thin, almost hesitant, as if waiting for my rejection to swallow him whole. I remember the words that came from my mouth, words that felt more like a reflex than a decision. "I'm going to Miami for a few weeks." It wasn't true, of course, but it was the only thing I could think of to end the conversation without creating further discomfort. I had no intention of actually going to Miami. It was just a lie, an excuse to put distance between us. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that when I returned, Zach would have forgotten all about it, that I would have slipped through his grasp as easily as I had entered his world so quietly, so unnoticed. But Zach was not the type to forget. The days that followed were filled with his messages, texts that seemed to increase in frequency and intensity, like the steady ticking of a clock in a room where no one could see the time. He asked me when I was leaving for Miami. He inquired about my plans with an insistence that felt increasingly invasive. And yet, I continued to deflect him, knowing that if I allowed his questions to settle in, they would begin to eat away at the fragile wall I had built between us. But then, one night, one moment, I felt the cold grip of his obsession. I was out with friends, trying to enjoy the fleeting freedom of the weekend, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I expected a simple "How's Miami?" or something equally benign. Instead, it was a message from Zach. "I thought you said you were going to Miami tonight," it read. My heart stopped. I had never told him when I was supposed to leave. I had never made any public mention of my plans. And yet he knew. It was a strange, hollow feeling that washed over me, then a sensation as if the ground beneath me had shifted, and I was no longer standing on anything solid. The world around me seemed to blur, to tilt slightly, as if I were caught in some warped, distorted version of reality. His words rattled around in my mind, filling the spaces with an all-encompassing dread that I could not escape. He was watching me. He was always watching me. When I returned home later that night, the sense of being watched only deepened. The apartment, usually a refuge, now seemed oppressive, as though it had been suffused with something dark. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling. My thoughts raced. I felt his presence like a shadow lingering in the room, the edges of my mind blurring with a sense of fear that I could not shake. Then came the knock. It was at an hour when nothing good happens late enough that the world should have been asleep, yet not so late that one could convince themselves it was a dream. I approached the door cautiously, my breath caught in my throat. There he was. Zach. Standing in the hallway, his face a twisted mask of need. "Open up," he said, his voice too calm, too controlled. "We need to talk." I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the door, trying to rationalize what was happening. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that my fears were exaggerated. But there was a sinking certainty in me, a certainty that spoke in cold, sharp tones. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice rising. "You lied to me. You used me." I recoiled. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they were spoken, as though he had been waiting for this moment, had been rehearsing this line in his head for weeks. It was the calmness with which he accused me, as though the betrayal was something he had been preparing for, something that had already happened long before I had even lied. I didn't. I began to protest, but my voice faltered. You used me to pass chemistry, he continued, his voice carrying a note of bitterness now. You didn't care about me. You never did. But I know we had chemistry. The words were a sick joke. The play on the subject we had both studied together was not lost on me, but it was the last straw. I yelled at him to leave, threatened that my father would be called. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him go. And then he did, but not without leaving something behind, something far worse than his presence in my home. Later that night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed again. A message from Zach. It was long. A sprawling manifesto of resentment, of hurt, of twisted affection. He accused me of using him, of manipulating him into being the person I wanted him to be, to help me cheat my way through a class I should have failed. He wrote of how he had been hurt by me, betrayed by someone he had once thought he could trust. But it was the last part of the message that made my blood run cold. He wrote that he thought we had chemistry, and that he would be an ideal husband. And then came the offer, the one he thought would set everything right. I can come over. We can talk.
I'll work this out.
I don't know how I got to sleep that night, but I do know that when I woke up, the world had irrevocably changed. And it wasn't just Zach's obsession, it was me too. I had begun to fear the world around me in ways I had never imagined before. My father, alarmed by my growing anxiety, called Zach. But Zach avoided answering. The following day, I filed a report with the police. I explained everything. The obsession, the stalking, the fear gnawing at me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. I wasn't safe because I knew that the system that was supposed to protect me was too slow, too distant, too unaware of the true nature of the threat. Zach was still out there, somewhere, always watching. And I was never alone again. As the eerie tales of the last day of school come to a close, we hope you felt the chill creep up your spine and the unease settle in. These true disturbing stories remind us that some endings are far darker than we could ever imagine. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, thank you for your unwavering support and for being a part of our ever-growing community. Your presence here means the world to us. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and remember the darkest stories often lie just beyond the classroom door. Until next time, stay tuned for more terrifying tales. See you in the next video.